Hello, everybody. Welcome to joining our webinar on developmental evaluation. I hope that you're all having a good morning or evening or afternoon, depending on where you are coming from. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands on which everybody is coming from today. I'm coming from the land of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I'd just like to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded on this land. It is, has, and always will be Aboriginal land. So my name is Jess Dart. You might have met me before. I am the Chief Evaluator and founder of Clear Horizon. And if you don't know about Clear Horizon, I think we are the biggest provider of evaluation services or specialist evaluation company in Asia Pacific. And I will introduce the panel. You can see Jamie and Kate, and shortly Michael will be arriving soon. So we're based in Melbourne, here in Australia, and we also run an academy, which we translate knowledge into learning opportunities, such as this webinar today. So if you've attended one of our webinars before, you'll know how it goes. Now, this is not the usual Zoom. This is a webinar mode, so you do interact a little bit differently. So we can't see you, so you can eat your lunch, do whatever you like. We can't hear you, so feel free to play music in the background if that makes you happy. And if you do want to interact with us, there are two ways. One is the chat function, and the other is the Q&A. So you can ask questions, and you can actually upvote other people's questions as well. And at the end, after we've had this panel, we will have a go answering the questions that have the highest vote. So you get some control over that. So you can also say hello to each other in the chat function if you want to say where you're from or what your lands are. That's the time you could do that now. Okay, so we will be recording this. It's recording already, and we'll be sending the link out to some people, but quite a lot of people actually watch it afterwards. So that's something you can do too, but be aware that you won't be recorded, just the panelists. So let me introduce the panel today. So I am going to start by introducing Michael Quinn Patton, a bit of a legend of evaluation. I've been, I think, since I was very little, I've been reading your book since I was a little evaluator. I don't know how long. And you have been shaping the field for so long, Michael. And you're the former president of the American Evaluation Society, the founder and director of Utilization-Focused Evaluation. How many books? 8 books, including 2 on developmental evaluation. Welcome, Michael. Would you like to say hello? Okay, and we're also very pleased to welcome back Kate. Hello, Kate. Lovely to have you back, one of our regulars. Kate is an independent consultant and a pragmatic academic, and co-founder of the Developmental Evaluation Institute, and director of the Knowledge Institute and member of the Connect group, who operate in New Zealand. And she's also the founding member of Aotearoa New Zealand Evaluation Society, often called ANZEA. And she also co-authored a book with Michael as well on the exemplars to developmental evaluation, because you can see we're building this picture of people who really know a lot about developmental evaluation, really created it, I would say. And finally, lovely to welcome back Jamie as well. Welcome, Jamie Gamble. Jamie's got extensive internal evaluation experience and is the author of a book or a publication called The Developmental Evaluation Primer, which was the first time I ever read about developmental evaluation. It's still a bit of a fantastic introductory text, isn't it? It's quite short. And so another groundbreaker in this space. So thank you so much for joining us. Maybe we can allow everybody to get to know you a bit. And I thought these guys actually know each other quite well. But I was thinking about whether you would like to share something about you out of work, so that the audience can get to know everybody a little bit. So who should I start with? Kate, I'm going to pick on you first. Tell us something that the audience wouldn't know. I think the panelists might know a lot about you, but something about you, what you like doing.
Oh, I'm a cane gardener. I'm a kindergartner, and together with my husband, we are transplanting paddocks. So we are revitalising paddocks and bringing them back into native bush. And we've transformed one area of land, and now we're doing another one. So bring back birds. Very engaged in that kind of work. So that's what I do.
I love gardening, but I'm not doing very well at the moment. Okay. How about you, Jamie? Tell us something about you.
Well, I'm an aspiring surfer. So Kate and I took a surfing lesson together in just before pandemic times. We were supposed to do a whole bunch of evaluation work. Some of that got kiboshed, but I got hooked, not because of any success, just because it seemed like it could be really fun. But recently have graduated from total beginner to just beginner, and actually stood up for 10 seconds the other day. So progress.
How about you, Michael? Surfing or gardening?
Well, I'll share an example of how developmental evaluation can apply personally when one is dealing with the unexpected and having to pivot. I got COVID early in the epidemic, mild case, but the symptoms lingered for a long time. And it's just when they were starting to talk about long COVID. And so my partner actually nagged me in going to the doctor and getting a checkup and figured out what it was. And it turned out that I had cancer of the thymus. And had I not gotten COVID, I would have probably not be with you now, because that had no other symptoms. And it was COVID that led my checkup. And that's one of the cancers you want to get early. So an unexpected pivot in my personal life that saved me and got me here today.
Well, that makes me think of my unexpected pivot this weekend. I have got COVID now. So I got COVID. Yeah, I'm on day 6 and I'm fine. But I went to a festival. I was really excited to go to Wome Adelaide, which is this fantastic world music festival. And I spent the whole time in the hotel on my own. Anyway, that was my unexpected pivot. But I did read some great books. Okay, so let's get stuck into this webinar. So my first question is, this is particularly for people who are totally new to it. So if you don't mind, guys, let's start right at the beginning. So what is it? I guess the question is, and how does it differ from other things that sound a bit similar? I'll start off. It's developmental evaluates some international development. It's not that, is it? We don't mean that. I know that's the first thing people say, the first mistake people make. But I'll ask Michael to talk about what it is and what it isn't. Off you go.
Thank you. Thank you for doing this, Jess. It's great to be with Kate and Jamie. I'm actually struck by the irony, Jess, of Clear Horizon sponsoring this, because developmental evaluation is especially for when the horizon is not clear. When it's uncertain about exactly where you're going. In fact, I recently came across a term that apparently is English slang. It was new to me, but if I was starting a consulting business for DE now, I would call it cottywomple. It apparently means to travel purposely toward an as yet unknown destination. And that's what developmental evaluation is. The more formal definition is developmental evaluation informed to support innovation and adaptation in complex dynamic environments. It brings to innovation and adaptation the processes of asking evaluative questions, applying evaluation logic, and gathering and reporting evaluative data to support project, program, product, or organizational development with timely feedback. That may not sound like much of a big deal at this point, because we've been doing a lot of pivoting with the pandemic. But in fact, evaluation is a part of the command and control planning way of thinking that dominates Western society over the last 50 years, which is how long I've been at this. And that means that the dominant motif is plan your work your plan, determine in ahead what you're going to accomplish, have a logic model to get there, and that evaluation is through inception reports is all set out in advance, what you're going to measure or what the results are going to be. And that turns out not to work where people are dealing with innovation, where they're figuring things out as they go along, where they're collaborating to get to a place where they want to co-create, where they have to pivot, as we had to do during the pandemic when they're complex dynamic systems. And so developmental evaluation operates in that space. It's based upon a set of principles rather than detailed practices. It has a developmental purpose. It uses data rigorously. It's utilization focused. It does occupy an innovation niche using complexity and systems thinking. And it's done co-creatively with the people who are carrying out the innovations or the adaptations with feedback in an ongoing, timely basis. So it occupies that particular niche where things are not clear, where they're being generated, where we're adapting, and we've needed evaluation that is outside the command and control, we're in charge and we can make it happen kind of mindset.
I know participants were keen to know what's the difference between formative evaluation and developmental, or M&E and developmental?
So formative evaluation in Scriven's originally conceptualization of that was based on curriculum evaluation, and his insight in 1967, when he created the terms formative and summative, was that before you decided to adopt a new curriculum, or more broadly, to certify a program as something that ought to be scaled or taken to new places, it ought to go through a period of working out the bugs, implementation addresses, making sure that things would work, figuring out what's working and not working, and forming the intervention to get it ready then for a model that could be disseminated. Formative evaluation then is about a model. It's still about a model. And what you're trying to do is make the model better in order to put it to a test of whether or not it ought to be scaled, spread around, other people adopting it. Developmental evaluation is where the model is adaptation, where there's not going to be a fixed model, where there's not going to be a highly prescribed, high fidelity way of going about things, but where you're adapting on an ongoing basis. This is true for things like leadership development programs, conflict mitigation programs, innovation, community development efforts, collaborative efforts where people are getting together and figuring out what to do, a large range of things where a fixed, prescribed, standardized model, which is often what the world is in search of, this holy grail of something you can verify and say it works and spread it everywhere. That's what folks are looking for. It's what funders are looking for. It's what government's working for. It just turns out that that's not really very often available. And that way of thinking is what's done a lot of harm in the world. So an adaptive mindset, culturally, contextually responsive and adaptable is where developmental evaluation fits. And it's not then prescriptively model-based, which formative is.
Thank you, Michael. But you, Kate, do you want to chip in? What do you think developmental evaluation is, isn't?
Well, I guess one of the things for me is, and I'll bring my slides up at this point, shall I? So I guess for me, one of the things about DE and what Michael stressed is that, and what he talked about, and actually your introduction was beautiful in that regard, because it talked about our pivots and the way in which we might adapt. And DE has also adapted and developed along the way. You know, we've learned as we go, and it's been pivoting. And I think one of the key changes that has emerged over the years that it's been around is that it's actually what I would consider to be a core evaluative practice for complexity. So although it's one of the principles of DE, and that's one of the things that we wrote about in the exemplar book, actually I think it's moved to the core of evaluative practice for complexity. And why do I say that? Well, the reason I say that is that the urgency, as Michael has pointed out, for the need for transformative action in the world given the implications of the epoch that we're in, the Anthropocene, is that we're calling into question, as he has done, the fundamentals of our existence, actually. So our belief in the application of reason and linear models and to uncover truth and the order, and that we can act in the world, it isn't really cutting it anymore. And I think that the Anthropocene epoch that we're in illustrates the entanglement that humans and nature have, and the fallacies of dichotomies like facts versus values, or subject versus object, or culture versus nature. That the fallacies of those kinds of dichotomies are starting to become really obvious to so many of us. And it's also clear that we can no longer hold this really detached orientation to the world. It's unlikely that doing those things is actually going to lead to the transformational planetary stewardship that I think we all need to have or be aiming for. So I guess that's one of the reasons I think, and that sets the scene for what I think DE is all about, because we have to do this work in relationship with each other, in relationship with the world around us, and we have to be able to innovate, not just with our methods, but what I would say, and it's a fancy word, but with our ontologies, with our beings. We have to be able to actually inhabit different kinds of practice if we're going to inform the world. And I see DE as precisely this kind of innovation for evaluation. It's a relational evaluative practice, and it's ideally suited to the complexity that we're in. It challenges us to find different ways of knowing about the world. It's grounded not in objectivity or subjectivity, but in something that I would call intersubjectivity. And that's just a fancy word for acknowledging the spiritual connections that bind us all to each other in the universe. Many cultures have different words for the same concept, Ubuntu actually being one example, and whakapapa from Māori being another. I think that the practice of DE is done in relationship with people in the planet, supporting processes of reflection and judgment and action that combine values, preferences, beliefs, histories, expert and community testimony, and data of all kinds in ways that actually give rise to those emergent possibilities that we're actually looking for in the world that we're in today. And the breakthroughs can be made through the strength and the number and quality of our relationships, actually, in different niches. And so this relational practice is at the centre of DE, and that's why I would say that it's ideally suited to complexity in the world that we're in now. DE is not observational or dispassionate either. We're actually actively engaged in making the world as DE evaluators, at the same time as supporting people, communities, and nature to act positively and generatively. For me, that's the essence of DE, and more so with every day that I practice it. Yeah.
Thank you, Kate. Wow. So it's definitely a method of today, isn't it? Thinking about what's happening in the world and where we're at. I thought I might just let Jamie chat. Say we were going to talk a little bit about the why, but I think we're already at the why. But if you'd like to add in, Jamie, about why you think it's important, why DE, why DE today?
Well, I think well said, Kate and Michael. Not too much I'd add, but I would say, let's just think about what's really great about evaluation. It's being systematic, thorough, critical thinking, evaluative reasoning, drawing on data and evidence, bringing that kind of comprehensiveness to questions of high uncertainty, high emergence, and a lot of novelty and creativity. There's a bit of oil and water there, right? That's not a natural fit. And I think that's the draw of having someone, people have aspirations for change, and change at a scale, kind of, Kate, you're alluding to this, that the need is greater than we've ever seen before. And so how do we get there better, faster? I think it is with the kind of thinking and support that a developmental evaluation assists those that are really driving those kind of bigger changes. And I think people do get there naturally, but time is running out. And so I think what DE offers is a way to accelerate and support that.
Do you want to chip in with that, Michael?
Well, the timeliness is one of the critical issues, and as Kate mentioned, a part of what is emerging for developmental evaluation is moving away from projects and programs to systems transformation. And so the systems piece of it that began as a way of thinking about projects and programs a decade ago has now moved to the forefront, where we realize that projects and programs don't transform systems, and that increasingly we're needing to deal with the way in which systems operate, structural racism, structural threats to the survival of humanity, as Kate was talking about, the ways in which industrial agriculture systematically destroys the environment, the inequities that are structural and systematic. These are things now that alliances are taking on to bring about systems transformation. And that's a very different kind of thing. Evaluation grew up out of the projects with a project mentality, a command and control mentality. And planning has been that way. And we're hand in glove with planners. Now that we're dealing with these larger global issues and the relationship between local and global, developmental evaluation helps in that relationship between the global and the local, what's now being called glocal. And those connections are new directions for the kind of work that we're doing together as evaluators.
Love it. Glocal. That's got to be the word of the year, hey? Local. Maybe that'll make it into the stakes of the new word. Okay, so my next bit I was going to chat about was just like, I think we've heard where we would use it. Where wouldn't you use DE? In what examples would you say, actually, that's not for DE? Who would, Jamie, where wouldn't you use DE?
Well, I think that the uses are, maybe I'd like to start with where we would and then go to where we wouldn't. Because I think there's something to build off in terms of what Michael's saying around the niches of DE. And particularly like an evolution, I think we're seeing on this, which is, I would say in the early days of developmental evaluation, the ones here that you could see on the screen around ongoing development, which is you've got this really dynamic environment, stuff that's changing, or this preformed, like you're really doing something new and novel, a new program, a new initiative, and you're really taking it from the seed of an idea into a creation. A lot of the early DE work I did was very programmatic in nature. But I think the shift, and Michael's really highlighting this, is the call that I'm seeing is to move to some of these other modes where you're seeing something and you're trying to adapt those principles of effectiveness to a new context. You're trying to move to a different point of intervention in the system, like policy or larger systems change. And Kate, another colleague of ours, Mark Cabage, and I were writing the update to the primer called The Companion, just in the year prior to the pandemic, and we were kind of saying, well, crisis response, maybe it is a niche, maybe it isn't a niche, and of course it's a niche, right? We're actually seeing this kind of massive crisis response needed and DE needed in support of that. I think where DE it does not apply is really where you don't see any of this, where you don't see a desire to adapt and change, or you don't have the kind of supports in place that will let those learnings manifest into actually changes on the ground. And so, one of the screens we look for in the early goings of a DE engagement is, are we linked to the strategy and decision makers, right? Are they at the table and engaged in this? Because we're going to learn stuff hard and fast. And if it doesn't get applied, what's the point, right? So I think, if you don't have those sort of conditions for success, and this is less about evaluative capacity and more about adaptive capacity, then DE may be a lot of work for not a lot of change.
Maybe we could have some examples of these. Kate, could you give us an example of a use that you think is No, really pertinent.
Yeah, I guess one of the pieces of work that I've been working on recently is a systems change initiative, but it started with some early prototypes in communities. So it's an initiative trying to change the incidence and severity of rheumatic fever among Māori Pacific populations in New Zealand who suffer the consequences in an inequitable way of rheumatic fever. And rather than that being a programmatic kind of approach to this, what they have done is they have the Ministry of Health here, or Te Whatu Ora, has funded a co-design initiative, which was launched in 2021 in the middle of the pandemic, to search for innovative approaches to this. And what they've done is they've actually focused the work on with 3 teams: a Māori team, a Samoan team, and a Tongan team in Auckland and Tamaki Makaurau. And these 3 design teams have each been allowed to lead and work on their own innovative approaches to addressing rheumatic fever in their respective communities. And I guess one of the things that we're seeing there is that they're challenging the dominant narratives and the dominant structures around the normal way of treating rheumatic fever, which is to push information out, to see it as a problem of crowding, of overcrowding, and lots of the what we call the deficit kind of understanding of rheumatic fever, and they are flipping that narrative in their early prototypes and in their insights in the early phase of that. And DE is walking alongside that. And I guess one of the things that we are right at that crux right now of helping them push back at the system, push back at the current structures. And we've actually decided, as part of the pivot that the DE will support in this project, is to do some work with the clinicians. So whilst those Māori and Tongan and Samoan communities can do their work, actually we need to shift mindsets. We need to shift structures in the system. If these are going to move in to the system, if these are going to have any chance of being embedded or changing the system, we actually need to work with the system itself and work with clinicians and others in the system as part of the work. So that's one of the DE learnings that has come through as part of this work. Yeah.
Thank you, Kate. And I wonder if we could have sort of like a global example. Michael, that's one of the participants have asked about that. Can it be done at a global scale?
Some of the international agencies are now beginning to work on DE, especially around the global issues, the global-local connection, and making sense of the things that supersede nation states and local conditions. In fact, a major effort that led to what I've now called Blue Marble evaluation, doing global systems change, came from the 2015, which was the transition year from the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals that we're now in. And 2015, the UN declared was the International Year of Evaluation. And there was a massive amount of building up of national evaluation units. There are now over 200 voluntary professional evaluation units around the world. We estimate there's some 75,000 evaluators in the world. Most of them are nation state based. And I did a lot of that training in 2015. And what became clear to me was that while there are certain things that can be dealt with at a national or local level, increasingly, the world is affected by global trends. Climate change can't be dealt with only at a nation state level. Human trafficking, pollution of land, water, and air, the international financial systems that affect the commerce worldwide, cyber terrorism, a whole range of issues that require global action and global responses. And so there are all kinds of groups coming together to work on these kinds of global issues, but evaluators haven't been getting invited to the table because we're viewed as doing this sort of small scale management kind of work. And so the idea of Blue Marble evaluation is bringing developmental evaluation principles into the global stage. And now working with groups like the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, a group of some 30 plus philanthropic foundations that are trying to change food and agriculture systems worldwide. Last year, our Blue Marble team did a major contribution to the United Nations Food Systems Summit. So we're beginning to apply developmental thinking to our global challenges and creating people who can engage in global systems change.
Blue Marble Evaluation is a book for those who are listening and not knowing what it is, that you can get one of Michael's books, and it's a fantastic, and it has this global perspective. So from global, can we come right down into the nitty gritty? Because I know a lot of our listeners really like to know the practical, how do you do it? And DE doesn't prescribe tools, does it? Because it's more of an approach of a purpose, really. But nonetheless, we do use things when we're doing it, don't we? So I'd really love to ask the panel to what is some of their favourite tools while they're doing DE. Let's start with you, Kate. I think you've got a really nifty little tool that you're going to talk about. My favourite.
Okay, so this is a really nifty tool that it's actually a practice. It's a questioning and sense making and inquiry practice that I'm giving full acknowledgements to Bob Williams, who I learned this from. I believe that Glenda Ouyang of HSD Institute also uses this, and the two of them have battled it out as to who actually developed it, but I learned it from Bob Williams. So pattern spotting comes from an understanding of the way in which we make sense of things actually as humans. So it starts with a very high level generalizations, that patterning that we do as humans. We're very good at it. At theming, this is more at the theming level. So the other thing I love about this tool is that it includes all the data. So unlike in lots of data analysis, we might get generalizations or themes, or we might get that middle, that bell curve, and we might look at the majority. We often don't deal with the exceptions, with the outliers in our data. And in theming, we often leave out those that are not in the themes, the exceptions to that, whereas this pattern spotting process, in using this pattern spotting process, we get to use all the data. And in fact, we look for the exceptions to the generalization. So we say, in general, what did I see? But what were the exceptions to that? And we might query that. Like, why do we think that is so? What's going on? Because the exceptions are just as true as the generalizations. The contradictions are the things that we see, or tensions in the data are, on the one hand, we see this thing going on, but on the other hand we see this other thing going on, and that they seem to contradict each other or be in tension with each other, and those things are really important for us to understand. We don't have to solve them, but noticing them is really important if we're going to make sense of complexity. And I guess the other things are the surprises, because we go in with our own expectations often and our own lenses when we're looking at data, and it's good for us to notice things that we didn't expect to see, or things that we expected to see that weren't there. And that's a deeper puzzling that we start to do. So this tool takes us down layers and levels of questioning and critical thinking. And then we get to the puzzles, which is things that are still puzzling me that we may need to follow up on. And I've used this at scale across 150 people in a room, looking at a big set of data, lots of data, streams of data, and I've used it in a reflection session with a very small team. So I think it can be used at different scales. And it can be used with lots of data or just a small amount of data. So it's a very, very useful tool for unpacking what might be going on in a situation. You can use it at different stages in an evaluation as well, beginning, middle, and end. So yeah, it's one of those ones that I fall back on a lot.
Fantastic, Kate. I know that's a really practical tool to share. Okay, Michael, do you have one you'd like to share?
Yeah, let me first go back for a moment to your earlier point about when DE is not appropriate, because that's worth knowing. And a part of that is where you actually have prescribed ways of doing things. You don't want people experimenting with that, and you want it well done. So, for example, there are accountability issues that when people are building bridges, you don't want them experimenting with, well, maybe we'll do it differently this time. You want the knowledge about how to build a bridge done. This is the interstate highway that connects Minneapolis and St. Paul in Minnesota, which collapsed in 2007 at rush hour. And it turns out that there were accountability issues about how the bridge was constructed and how the inspections were carried out, and the inspection reports were ignored. So that we don't want the people who are piloting our planes to suddenly decide, well, let's experiment with flying in some different way today. Or there are medications that are known to be prescribed in certain ways that ought to be used in those ways. So when we know what works, then you do what works. What we're talking about is in complex situations where what works is highly situational, dynamic, cultural, and needs to be responsive. And one of the tools that I find particularly useful for that is a framework that's not unlike some of what Kate was just talking about, that allows you to track different kinds of developments in an organization. This came out of a retrospective developmental evaluation of the World Food Program response to COVID. And one of the ways with ongoing organizations to begin DE is not by looking forward, but by doing a retrospective developmental evaluation. How did we get to where we are now? What kind of developments are a part of our history? And in the World Food Program response to COVID, we identified 5 kinds of institutional reaction to track and look at how each of them occurred and what their implications were. What things were being done that were maintained? What things were being done that were expanded? What kind of pivots took place, the lower left? What kind of innovations occurred, and what had to be stopped? And so this gives you a way of looking at both what's happened developmentally, what have we maintained, what have we expanded, what have we pivoted, what have we innovated, what have we stopped, and then you can track those kind of things going forward. So it's a conceptual framework to think about different kinds and levels of adaptation. A related kind of tool that this works with is any of the reflective practice tools, where you're engaged in a cycle of people taking action, the reactions to that action, interacting with them about what it means, reflecting and adapting. A great deal of what I do in developmental evaluation is going in with people and helping them look at what they've been doing, reflect on it. What did they think was going to happen? What are the variations in what happened? As Kate said, look at the outliers, look at the patterns, and that's a form of reflective practice that becomes a way of doing business in organizations, to build in the time for that, to build in the commitment to it. People get very busy, and actually allocating time to do evaluative thinking and reflective practice is probably the biggest barrier to doing developmental evaluation. It's one of the reasons why they like to have external evaluators just take it on so they don't have to bother with it. But when you get a culture of learning, a culture of development, a culture of inquiry, a culture of evaluative thinking, then people begin to get hungry to do this because they're learning so much and figuring out how to adapt and pivot in ways that are meaningful.
Fantastic, Michael. Thank you very much for that. That cycle, really important to think of it in a cycle. How about Jamie? Did you want to talk about any tools or approaches that you find particularly useful in practice?
Yeah, I'll be really quick, Jess. I know we want to get to some questions. One, I'll just throw out liberating structures as a really useful resource for tons of tools. There's just so much in there. And I think the maybe the tip for people who want to grab tools and use them is really understand what's the essence of what this tool is trying to do. And then feel free to hack it, make it work to whatever it is you're trying to do, right? You can sort of bend the rules to make it fit. But unless you know the essence of what the tool is, sometimes you bend an essential rule, which actually just dismantles the purpose of the tool in the first place. I think the thing I want to most point people to, though, is kind of what Michael just did, which is he brought up an interpretive framework, right? In Michael's first example, it was a way of sort of making sense of a whole bunch of information. And so I find as a developmental evaluator, I've got a basket full of interpretive frameworks that I draw upon to help people structure their thinking around a particular set of data or a challenge or something that they're working through. So there's two on the screen in front of you. One, if you've done any design thinking, you recognize this as the desirability, feasibility, viability overlapping circles. The bottom right, eco-cycle, panarchy, there's many versions and ways of it. And I won't get into what they are, but they are just have been useful to me time and time again to help people think about their data and then map that onto their strategy in terms of thinking about what they want to do going forward. In the companion, we've got, the book that Kate, Mark Kabaj and I wrote, again, there's just a whole list of interpretive frameworks in there. If you want to go there as a resource, you can find some that may be suitable to your situation. Of course, you'd have to just take one of these, learn about it, and go deeper, but this might be a prompt to find some things that may be useful to you. And I'll leave it there, Jess.
Thanks, Jamie, and thanks for mentioning that book, The Companion to Developmental. I think I missed that one that you all put together. So there are quite a lot, for the people listening, it's quite a lot written about developmental evaluation for you to follow up on. Maybe we can send out after this, we can send out a list of resources of all the books that are written about it, mainly by you three. So yeah, we got the people in the room here. And you mentioned liberating structures there as well, Jamie, if you could put a link in. So the final question I've got before we get on to answering the audience questions is about the future of DE. I think we might have sort of like hit on this a little bit, but the things are changing pretty fast in this world we're in. So where do you think it's headed? What's next? What advances do you actually see for developmental evaluation? So I'll start with Kate.
Look, I think Michael's leading the way in terms of he moved very quickly onto principles focused and then to blue marble evaluation. So I do a plug for both of those. Hey, listen, sorry everybody about the building noises that are in the background. I just want to acknowledge that it's not you, but we've got the workers out there and I can't quieten them down or stop them. So bear with me. So I would just say, I do a plug for those because that's definitely moved DE into blue marble, definitely into the global space and into the transformative at scale systems change at scale space. But I think the other thing I'm seeing in New Zealand is DE is being picked up and adapted by many of our Indigenous communities. So it's a practice that seems to resonate, and they are developing it and using it in ways that make sense for them. And I think that's only going to get more so. And we'll see our first Indigenous DE guide, I imagine, before too long. I'm working with some colleagues who are rapidly working in that space to indigenize essentially what feels like an evaluative practice that can work in Indigenous spaces.
Thank you, Kate. How about you, Jamie? Future, where's it headed?
Well, I agree with Kate. Michael's leading the way, and I think we'll have a lot to say on this. I'm seeing more and more inquiries that are at that intersection of strategy and evaluation, and they are crossing domains or are interdisciplinary. So, for example, have two projects right now that intersect. One intersects climate and art, and the other intersects climate and health. And so I think it's really helping people to use that evaluative thinking to think about strategies that bridge these worlds together, and maybe use one as a lever for advancing an agenda in the other. And, and I think, Alex's question around mission-oriented innovation is where I'm seeing some of this happen, right? Like organizations that have tried to pursue change as an intermediary within a large system like healthcare around a climate agenda are asking questions around just purpose and direction. Like everything is on the table. Mission, how we work, our approach. They're ready to sort of reassemble because they know they want to make a lot of progress on that they care so much about. So I'm not sure if I completely understood the question, but I'm seeing more and more readiness to really pivot off some established structural pieces in organizations like mission, like governance, that sort of thing, more than I have seen previously.
How about you, Michael? What's the future?
Well, it's about a word that Kate brought up earlier, and it's about transformation. The threats to the future of humanity are quite serious. And when we talk about systems transformation, it's a very different way of going about what is happening. And we're talking about transformation. We are talking about really big changes, things like the end of colonialism, the end of slavery, the end of apartheid, the Me Too movement, the efforts to change how we live and consume and relate to the earth, reversing the climate emergency, dealing with issues of equity and sustainability. And so what this means is that the agenda for all evaluation becomes evaluation for transformational change. The International Development Evaluation Association, in their last face-to-face meeting before the pandemic in Prague in 2019, adopted a declaration on evaluation for transformational change that included that all evaluations should address both sustainability and equity, that these become universal criteria because the call was for all hands on board. And in fact, there's, I think, substantial evidence that evaluation is more part of the problem than part of the solution, because what I find often happening, and it's one of the major reasons for DE and principles-focused evaluation, blue marble evaluation, as a set of ways of changing how we go about our business, is I hear from a lot of people trying to do innovative systems change and have mandated evaluations that are old logic models, old theories of change, old linear kinds of SMART goals that they're required and mandated to do. And they end up changing what they would do in order to fit narrow old evaluation criteria. And so for us to be a part of the solution means that we have to be able to support people engaged in transformational change. We started out 50 years ago, focused primarily on project goal attainment. Then we did logic models, we got the theory of change, and the future is about theory of transformation. I've done a video about this. I'll put some video resources in. I've got a couple of videos about developmental evaluation, about how a theory of transformation is different from a theory of change, about how systems change is different than project outcomes. And that new direction is where people are making a difference, coming together in global alliances, working with people locally, as well as building on indigenous knowledge, building upon the history of indigenous people who have a different relationship with the land and a different way of engaging with each other, that these new directions are going to support transformation. And evaluation needs to move from being problematic and part of the problem by putting people in narrow boxes to a more cross silos, systems-wide, complexity dealing, developmental approach to global systems transformation. That's where I see the future. And if we don't get there, we're all going to be in trouble.
Thank you, Michael. That was very powerful. And it actually links into a question that we've got that's been upvoted the most. I mean, in a way, what we're saying is the way traditional evaluation is done is part of the problem. And we need to transform ourselves as well. So Judy asks us, how can we change structures that hold dominant evaluation approaches in place? How do we do that? How can we help people move out of their comfort zones to allow for MEL or evaluation that better actually, works with this? So how do we shift evaluation? Anybody can answer. Free for all.
I get this question a lot, and my response is a lyric from a song by Leonard Cohen called Anthem. Some of you may know it, in which he says, look for the cracks, because the cracks is where the light gets through. Every organization has cracks, no matter how oppressive it may seem, bureaucratic, rigid. You look for allies, you look for early adopters, and you look for the way in which leaders are using the language without actually knowing what it means. There aren't many major organizations these days where people aren't talking about innovation, adaptation, systems, and complexity, even transformation. The language is out there. The United Nations Food Systems Summit last year was about transforming food systems. But they were talking about it at a very surface level. It was still rhetoric. Our job is to call them on the rhetoric, is to say, oh, you're interested in systems. Well, let's look at what we actually can do about systems change. It turned out to be different from a project. Who knew? And that it's looking for the people who are serious about this, who recognize that things need to be different. So look for allies, look for common thinkers, get up on the literature, look for evaluators who are on board with this way of thinking. And that's how you build momentum, with early adopters, with allies, with finding where the light comes through, and building momentum from there.
Well,
can I just add one more thing, Jess? Can I add one
Yeah,
more thing to
me
Michael?
too.
I mean, I wanted to jump back to the early, Judy, your question does come up for me as well. And one of the tactics, if you like, it's a tactic that I've used here in New Zealand, and that is, and it's getting easier as you get older, because you don't really care what people think of you as you get older. But I guess one of the things is to bring in heavy hitters into the leadership team of an organisation. To like many years ago, I brought Michael into a government organisation to think differently about evaluation, so that I go back to something that he wrote many, many years ago, which is to insist that evaluation is a leadership function, and actually thinking evaluatively and reasoning evaluatively is a leadership function, and therefore they need to take this stuff seriously. And actually, by bringing in a couple of heavy hitters who challenge, as Michael says, challenge them on their rhetoric, expose some of the light, but also develop a relationship. As we get older, it's develop relationships with those allies, with those seniors in those organisations who are prepared to try something a bit different. I think is the key in some of these organisations. And if they can see something working, they do something once and it does make a difference, then they're more likely to keep shifting. Yeah, I'll let Jamie finish.
Great stuff. I would add too, I find as a development evaluator, I do a lot of plate spinning, which is early on, people buy into the rhetoric of innovation and change and adaptation, and then it degrades over time. You snap back into the kind of more traditional framings. And so I find part of my job is when I'm sharing findings, sharing data, facilitating sessions, is to insist on that same leadership group to be present and to provide reminders of, remember, we agreed we were going to do really innovative work here, and you have these aspirations, and this is what it looks like. And as much as possible, provide some really good reinforcing feedback that they are in that space and they should remain in that space, because otherwise that space closes pretty quickly in organizations.
Well, fantastic. So I might pick another question off the list. Let me have a look. So yeah, there's one specific one from Carolyn. Hello, Carolyn Cavore. Do we see a practical or even theoretical role for developmental evaluation in shaping science strategy when research entities are looking for the future of R&D, for example? Does anybody work with science strategies?
Well, I love that question, because it lets me offer another new direction for evaluation. And that actually comes out of the challenges around science generally in our world, the anti-science pushback, and the marches for science that occurred in 2017. I was in the first one of those in Washington, D.C., and in the course of that march, people are talking about what's your connection to science. And there were all kinds of disciplines present. And I found myself, I wrote an article about this, I found myself saying, for the first time in my life, I'm an evaluation scientist. And they'd say, well, what's that? And I said, well, and I developed this sort of elevator speech in the 4 hours of the march. As I repeated it and honed it down, I said, well, science is the study of how the world works. Evaluation science is the study of how interventions trying to change the world work. And so a part of, I think, part of the new direction for evaluation, and there's a new International Evaluation Academy devoted to this theme, is coming to view evaluation itself as science, so that science policy ought to include evaluation scientists, people who think evaluatively. Unfortunately, evaluation's gotten stuck in an accountability box, in a management box, in a small-scale tinkering kind of box. But in fact, scientific thinking, critical thinking, Jamie mentioned, is what science is about. And so I think that we can elevate the status of our profession. I now refer to myself as an evaluation scientist, and I find that that changes how I'm received at places like the Centers for Disease Control, when I'm working with ag scientists, when I'm working with natural scientists, to take on the imprimatur of we're going to do science policy as evaluation scientists, and therefore we have an interest in science policy. We have skin in the game. It's not just looking in from the outside. We are scientists. We engage in evaluation science.
Wow. Thank you so much. And it is 10 o'clock. And Lee said I was allowed to go on for 2 more minutes, so I am. But time to wrap it up. So what can I say? I've so much enjoyed having you all here today, and I hope the audience has too. There's been a whole lot of resources shared. Thank you, audience, for adding in links and things. And we will send out a little bundle of resources to you all after this. And of course, like we're doing this webinar now because we are launching the next Academy course in Developmental Evaluation, which starts on the 26th of May. And it's with Kate, Jamie, and myself. And that actually is quite a basic course that steps out how developmental evaluation works with case studies and things, if you're interested.